You might not be aware of this, but the fastest growing segment of the voting population are people like me, people who are not a member of any party. About 20% of Californians today consider themselves to be independent. And I think part of the problem is not that there's something wrong with the parties, but that the parties have been hijacked by corrupt and greedy individuals, people who care more about their own careers and their wealthy and powerful friends than they do about serving the public. Not many people know this, but in 1958, the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate passed a resolution called the U.S. Government Code of Ethics. You wouldn't think that Congress would have a code of ethics, but it really does. And the first thing it says is that government officials must put loyalty to country ahead of loyalty to party. How many members of Congress do you think do that? Yeah, probably zero. And it's sad because, especially today, we need their help. We have these huge problems that some of which government created, and which only some entity as big as government can help solve. I'm not saying that government can do everything. Of course it can't. Most of what we do in our daily lives is in our hands. But there are some problems, some challenges that are so enormous that if we don't have the cooperation of our fellow citizens, we'll never solve these problems. And Ronald Reagan is much admired by a lot of people, but he said something that I just don't agree with. He said the 9 most frightening words are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I don't think those are frightening words. When a police officer shows up if there's a crime, when a firefighter shows up if your house is burning, when some social agency shows up when you've lost your home to some natural disaster, these are government functions that are good. Now, not everything government does is good. Part of the problem is that it has been, the system has been corrupted. And I don't want to point fingers, but some of the people who are supposed to be representing us are responsible for this corruption. And that's one of the reasons I went. I never had any intention of being a politician. I don't think of myself as being a politician. I'm a journalist. I ask questions. I try to find the truth. There was a study done in England about 10 years ago, and you'll be shocked to know that they discovered that the vast majority of people, at least in that country, expect politicians to lie. Well, I think we probably would agree with that, because over time that's what history has taught us, that people don't always tell the truth. And especially when they have some motivation to bend reality to their liking or to please us, that's understandable. We can talk about a lot of issues today. There are a lot of things that we're all concerned about. Obviously, there's nothing more important to us at this moment in our history than our economy. And in conversation after conversation that I have with people, everyone points to the same solution. It's not lowering taxes, it's not getting rid of regulations, it's not cutting services, it's not even cutting spending. All of those things are important, but nothing will solve our national economic challenges other than creating more jobs. If we don't have more people working, if we don't have more people earning and spending, we'll never turn this around. And that's true whether someone has just graduated from college or is just about to retire. Throughout the spectrum, we need more people working. We all know, living here in the Central Valley, how many businesses have closed over the last 10 years. It's because they don't have enough customers. It's not because their taxes are too high or because they're overregulated. Sure, business owners always want to pay less. We want to pay less as consumers. But that's not going to put people back to work. And it's certainly not going to turn around our national economic challenges. So here I am, a journalist who is able to identify these problems. And suddenly I find, coming back from overseas where people are struggling for their independence, I find that here in my own district, I was born in Fresno, by the way, I'm from the Valley, I've lived around the country and around the world, and I come back home to see that in election after election, there's only one name on the ballot for various offices. It's not very democratic. And I think that at the very least, we have a responsibility as citizens to be able to ask our elected representatives why they make the choices they make on our behalf, why their policies have led to these terrible results that we're witnessing today. It's not because they are evil people. I don't think that's true. I think that we all do the best we can. But when people make bad choices, we as citizens have the right to ask them about that. And if they don't have good answers, we deserve a different choice. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to offer a different choice, I hope a better choice. And I'm also here to challenge the incumbent. Kevin McCarthy has been representing this district in Sacramento and in Washington for 10 years. 2 terms in the state legislature and now 3 terms in Congress. My question to you is the same question Ronald Reagan asked when he was running for president. Are you better off today than you were when you first seconded to represent you? Is your house working? Is your future, is the future of your children and your grandchildren brighter today than it was before he came into political office? If the answer is yes, by all means, re-elect him. But if you think that his policies are not serving you, then maybe it's time for a change. I talked about jobs. Jobs are found everywhere. Government's only one source. Government is a good source of jobs. I'm certain that you all remember that in 1961, when John Kennedy delivered his State of the Union, he talked about the importance of trying to put a man on the moon. We did that within 10 years, just as he said we should. But at the time, a lot of people said, how are we going to afford this? This is billions of dollars, and what good is it going to do to put a man on the moon? Well, we found the money to do it. And it created lots of jobs, and it produced a lot of new technology. I don't know how many of you own a computer. We wouldn't have personal computers but for the space program. I don't know how many of you use Velcro. We wouldn't have Velcro but for the space program. From one end of the spectrum to the other, and all the jobs it created. Well, it's easy to say no. It's easy to say we can't do this. It's hard to say I'm willing to take a chance. I'm willing to put my neck on the chopping block. And if I'm wrong, fire. But that's what I'm willing to say. And I'm willing to say that about the high-speed rail. I know it's unpopular in many quarters, and I know it's an imperfect plan. But to simply say, well, let's not do it, is absurd. Let's do it right. Let's find the money, and let's be sure that it actually does what we want it to do, in part because we need to do something about our state's transportation. We can't build more freeways. We're not going to build more airports. And we're going to double our population before long. We need to move people up and down the state, including through the Central Valley. We need to find a way to do this. And we can do this. It's really easy to say it's impossible. I hate that word. I spent a lot of time in countries where people admired us because we didn't believe in impossibility. People in Russia said to me, the reason you landed on the moon was because you didn't understand that it was impossible. Well, that's true. We don't accept the notion of impossibility. I think we need to get over this cowardice that a lot of people in politics have. It is a business for timid people. Politicians tend not to take risks because risks are a good way not to get reelected. There's a famous story about a French politician who was sitting at a sidewalk cafe in Paris a couple centuries ago, and suddenly this mob of people come running by. And he says, I have to go find out where they're headed so that I can lead them there. You know, that's what a lot of politicians do. They find out what we want, and then they say, well, here's my idea, what you want. It's good to represent what people want, but it's important to represent our interests, not just our desires. It's really easy for us to close our eyes, stick our head in the sand, and say, well, this is the best we can do. That's not who we are. This country isn't this way, isn't still the leading destination of the world because we operated out of fear. We saved the world from tyranny and from fascism. We created the best form of government that has ever existed. We can do better than this. My opponent has been in Congress for 6 years. In that time, he has proposed, he's written, one bill that became law. And it was to rename a post office in honor of Buck Owens. Buck Owens was a great musician, but I think I can do better than one bill in 6 years. Particularly at a time when we need both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, to work together. All they're doing right now is sitting there with their arms crossed and saying, no, 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 no. And that's why it's time to put someone in office who is independent of these parties. The parties are great. They have a purpose. but they can't continue to hold this stranglehold on our government. We need to turn this around. I want to say one last thing, and then I really do want to hear from you. There is a difference between the two parties. But the main difference between the two parties is that one is in power today and the other isn't. That's the main difference between the two parties. Philosophically, they do have differences. They approach governance in different ways. But today, as we sit here, I defy you to explain to me what the fundamental difference is between the Democrats and the Republicans. One party's in power, the other party isn't. In my view, that's the main difference between them today. And that's not serving us. They need to start working together again. 50 years ago, this was not the case. One party was in power, the other party wasn't, but they worked together. They treated each other as fellow citizens, not as the enemy. And if I can't do anything else, being a journalist, I believe that I can change this culture in Washington of treating other people, other Americans, as the enemy. We have to stop doing that. I thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm delighted to hear your questions.
I was going to ask, what kind of ideas would you have for private sector growth in jobs, private sector?
We have this great opportunity, especially right here in Bakersfield, to form public-private partnerships. You know, we have some of the lowest rates of graduation from high school and college in America. The average place in the United States has about 30% of its population with college degrees. We have about 15%. Our businesses, our actual businesses and our prospective businesses, don't find enough trained workers here to fill the positions that they have open. Because people aren't prepared for the jobs, not just the jobs of today, the jobs of tomorrow. We need businesses to invest in education, to work together with government institutions like colleges and universities, so that they don't have to train people, and especially so that they don't have to import labor. It's bad enough that workers are brought here from elsewhere in the country. We're bringing people here from elsewhere in the world. And the other thing that I would strongly encourage us to do is change the law so that people who graduate from college in this country don't take the education that we've provided them and go back home, go back to some other country. I have a godson who is Russian. I brought him here, I put him through college, and he's now an American citizen. And he stayed here, and he's using what he learned in this country. He lives in Silicon Valley, he works in the high-tech industry. And I think that's what we should be doing as a country. We should be encouraging foreign students who come here to learn to stay here, to become American citizens, to contribute to our economy, to our society. It's just nuts that we say, okay, now you have your education, your visa has expired, leave. We don't just not encourage them to stay, we encourage them to go. That should be changed. But the other important opportunity, I think, that we have is in the energy field. You know, we are famous, particularly right here in Kern County, for oil. And oil is a very fine business, and we're not ever going to stop. As long as we can continue accessing more petroleum, we're going to continue finding use for oil products, for petroleum products. But that's not enough. We have such great demand on energy, and there's so many opportunities here. I don't understand why every new construction in the Central Valley doesn't have solar panels on the roof. It's a great opportunity. People like to condemn this company up in the Bay Area, Solyndra, I think it was called, and it was a very bad investment. We shouldn't have done it. But that doesn't condemn the entire renewable energy sector. There's so many ways in which we can produce new energy in ways that are environmentally friendly and that produce jobs. We need to do that. And this is a great place to start. Cost of labor is relatively low. The cost of housing, unfortunately, is catastrophically low. People will come here. People will move here if we form these public-private partnerships and if we form policies so that businesses are encouraged to open businesses like that here, companies like that here. There's a great concept that's being used in Europe. I think Germany began it. There are some American cities that also promote this idea of putting, for example, solar panels or wind turbines on the roof of your home, your real estate that belongs to you, and then leasing it out to energy companies who can then produce that energy and either sell it back to you at an equivalent or even lower cost than what you're paying to PG&E. Or you can just use it yourself. And a lot of people are starting to do that. But it also requires government policy to make it, to provide the incentives for companies to be able to produce such businesses. These are just a few ideas. There are many more. Mostly what we need is an open door policy in Congress so that people with good new ideas will be listened to and encouraged and not shooed away to they're not a member of one party or the other.
I watched a news show yesterday, and this venture capitalist who has made billions of dollars said the way to rebound the economy is to get the middle class working and spending. That's the biggest problem we got, is that a lot of the manufacturing facilities are all overseas now. There was one company that had come back to New York and started a small silicon factory to make microchips. He went up to Visalia, and a guy moved to Mexico, but he couldn't keep the standards, he couldn't keep the workers. So he moved back to Visalia, his hometown.
That's great.
Now, we have got computer engineering programs starting at Cal State that are pretty good, I think. And we got Chevron supporting a lot of it. But we need more support out there. Then we could ask the Bay Area, the Silicon Bay area, where they're moving all the way down to Morgan Hill and almost to Gilroy for housing, to bring some of the high-tech here. What can we do to get Bakersfield businesses involved with the college more and support them? And what can the federal government do to help?
The first thing we can do is ask our congressmen to stop opposing the renewal of Pell Grants. There are students who cannot afford to go to college, who would gladly do so if they were provided not just lower interest rates on their loans, but grants, so that those who can't afford tuition, and this is true not only in four-year universities, let alone private universities, but even at Bakersfield College. It's become unaffordable for so many people. Kids who have to go straight to work to keep their families at home, keep a roof over their heads. We need to demand that our representatives in Congress do more to invest in education. And as far as Silicon Valley is concerned, I think there ought to be a partnership between Silicon Valley and the Central Valley. High-speed rail is a good idea because that'll enable people to make the commute in an hour. But beyond that, again, investing in a place where the cost of living is low. I don't know the last time you looked for housing in San Jose. If you're not in the 1% or the 1/2 of 1%, forget about it. I grew up there, and I was shocked when I went back and saw how much this $16,000 house that I grew up in was selling for now. It's really shocking. But the other thing that I think the federal government can do, which again, I'm sorry to say, our congressman has not done, is to provide federal investments in high technology companies here. And instead, that's one of the places where Kevin McCarthy has targeted cuts. We need to not just stop the cuts, we need to grow. We talk about our fear of debt, and that's a good thing to be afraid of. But we have to turn the economy around before we can start thinking about this as a normal economy again. Very few of us remember firsthand the consequences of the Great Depression. We were either not alive, in my case, or small children. But there are so many similarities today between the economy in the United States from the Depression and now. We're not seeing people on the street selling pencils and apples, but we do have people working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And if we don't have, as I said, the federal government isn't the solution to all problems, but if we don't have the government restarting this economic engine, we're in trouble. But what is Congress doing? They're folding their arms and saying, we're not going to pass a jobs bill because it's not our jobs bill. That's not a good enough answer. They've got to start working together again and make it possible for people, not just to find work, but to open businesses. one of the best opportunities for new businesses is to expand the Small Business Administration. Unfortunately, the people who are controlling Congress have said, no, we're going to cut small business loans. That's just nuts. It's a great opportunity. Now, there is a lie that is often told that small businesses are the greatest employers in the country. They're important. They're very important. But they don't employ the most people. Government employs the most people, and big businesses employ the most people. And we have to stop lying. We have to start requiring that people who are representing us make decisions based on facts. And it's really easy to make speeches and be a demagogue, but that doesn't solve the problems.
Too much finger pointing and not.
Well, it's easy to look like wrong.
Not long ago, President Obama eliminated "don't ask, don't tell" in the military.
Right.
And now there's a lot of people in the military who are gays and want gay marriage. And then there's other advocates that want women in the front lines in combat. And all I can see is our armed forces going to hell in the basket. And what are your views on that?
I trust the commanders of the armed forces to tell us what policies they would like to see. Of course, just because they would like to see them doesn't necessarily mean we have to pass it. We have to use common sense. It's still a civilian government. I've been in places where the military actually ran the government. Those places didn't turn out so well. Just ask Muammar Gaddafi or some of the other dictators who got by the wayside. But I think if we trust the judgment of military commanders to tell us what works best, I think we're better off than just making decisions based on the social policies that we like. There are plenty of countries in the world where not only is sexual orientation not a question, but where women are commanders on the front line. And one of the most powerful military forces on the planet is in Israel. And everybody serves, men and women alike. I'll tell you what I think is, the question you ask is a complicated one because it deals with tradition. And military tradition changes over time, but it doesn't change very quickly. And I think we need to be careful that we accommodate not just today's needs, but the history of the armed forces. And that's not a decision you want to make quickly. I think fast change is worse than no change at all sometimes. But the only thing I want to point out is that the Joint Chiefs supported these policies. Now, I don't know whether they supported them because it was the politic thing to do or because they truly believed that it was the right thing to do. But I think we need to trust their judgment. At the same time, I think we have a more serious problem, which is that not enough people serve. The biggest problem with the armed forces today is they're fighting all alone, except for those who are in uniform and their families. The rest of us are sitting on the sidelines saying, we support the troops, but what are we actually doing? I would like to see a return to national service, to universal national service. I think everybody ought to serve. Not everybody's suited to be a frontline soldier. I understand that. But I don't see any reason why everybody can't go through basic training. I don't see a reason why everybody can't do some kind of service, civilian service, work in a hospital, work in some of our national parks that are being shut down. I mean, these are travesties. Everybody ought to serve. There should be no excuse for only those people. I know we have a volunteer army, but they shouldn't be the only ones making sacrifices. We say this is a time of war. Well, what are we doing? You know, what are we told? Go shopping. That's not a good enough answer. We all need to make sacrifices. On the specific questions of who should serve and in what capacity, I think we need to be careful. I think we need to make those choices deliberately. But I also think we should not allow our prejudices to determine what's in the best interest of our country. And sometimes what we personally believe, whether it's for religious reasons or traditional reasons, sometimes what we believe doesn't necessarily serve the best interests of our country. And I think the great thing about this country is that we accommodate each other. That I might not think that 2 men or 2 women ought to be married, but 200 years ago, 300 years ago, when the country was coming together, a lot of people didn't think that Baptists or Presbyterians or Jews or Muslims had a place in the country. but we accommodated everyone. We found a way to say, I don't agree with you. I don't like you. I don't want you in my house. But this country is for everybody. And we learn to live with everybody's differences. And again, I think that's one of the benefits of universal service. There were no, as they say, there are no atheists in foxholes. There were no religious disputes during World War II in foxholes, because you didn't care whether, at that time, the man to your right or to your left was of this religion or this sexual orientation. He was watching your back. And I think we need to return to that, particularly when it comes to the ultimate interests of our country. If you don't want someone in your church, if you don't want someone in your family, if you don't want someone in your home, that's your right. But it's not your right to tell someone else what he or she can believe. And I don't think it's okay to tell two adults how they should live. Ronald Reagan said, I keep quoting that man today, I blame him for some things, but I admire him for some things. And Ronald Reagan said, if it doesn't scare the horses, it shouldn't matter to our country. And I think we need to get over our need to tell other people that they have to believe what we believe. We can share our beliefs. We can encourage people to believe what we believe. But part of the purpose of this country is to allow people to believe what they want and not allow anyone to force his or her views on anybody else. We can argue about these things. We can discuss whether they're right or wrong. But at the end of the day, I think we have to respect each other. My father, God rest his soul, who was an immigrant who came here from Europe. He was Greek and fled. His family fled post-World War I turmoil in Turkey. He taught me one thing above all else: respect. Respect yourself, respect other people. And if I can do nothing else in public life, I mean to do that. I know that it's not always popular to stand up for people who hold views that are unpopular. But freedom means freedom for everybody. And I'm quoting Dick Cheney. Yes, ma'am.
I might correct you on something I just read in the paper, that in Israel, the Orthodox do not have to serve in the military.
I didn't know that.
That was in the California, if you can believe it, California. I worked for the Army as a civilian in the 60s. In those days, if a young man or woman, but it was mostly men, were drafted, they could get a skill. They could get training. They could drive a truck. They could cook. Now, the military is contracting everything out. I have a grandson who's signed up for the Marines, and my husband said he's going to be cannon fodder, because he's going to go to Afghanistan or a similar place, and I don't expect him to come back. But this young man thinks he's going to get a trade in the service, and they don't. Everything's contracted out. Even in the paper, they're bringing supplies from Pakistan to Afghanistan. Civilians are running those convoys.
Let me tell you, first of all, I've been to both Afghanistan and Iraq as a war correspondent. For those of you who don't know, I was part of that last wave of prospective draftees during the Vietnam War, and there was this system where, depending on what your birthday was, there was a lottery. And I had a very low number, so I knew I was going. I made the rounds, and the Army was offering to send me to language school. I have an interest in languages, so I was going to go. I took the physical and was ready to ship out. And I came home that night, and Richard Nixon ended the grant. So, I stayed in college, and then, of course, I went off to war as a reporter without benefit of uniform or firearms. But I have developed a very strong appreciation for people in the armed forces. My concern is that the policies are not always, and the missions are not always the best missions. We ask them to do things, and they do everything for us that we ask them to do. But sometimes we ask them to do things that are bad policy. And I have not met too many people in the course of this campaign who think 10 years later that it still was a good idea for us to send our troops to Iraq or even necessarily Afghanistan. But as far as what benefits they derive from serving, pardon me, the honor of serving, it's a mixed bag, you're right, because a lot of it does get contracted out. But there is also a lot of training. The GI Bill still exists, it just doesn't get funded properly. My concern is that we're not taking care of them when they come home. I just read that something like 18 vets every day in this country commit suicide. This is a catastrophe. It takes months for them to get mental health care. And again, I'm sorry, but our congressman has not supported funding for those kinds of programs, not to mention inadequate health care overall. What are we doing to our economy? They come back after serving overseas, and what jobs are available to them? There should not be one single veteran in the United States of America who's homeless. This is a shame. We should all, every single one of us, ought to be embarrassed about this. We ought not let Congress spend one day in recess without solving that problem. It is a national shame. And I know it's not easy to make national policy, and I know that politics is a difficult business, but if we're not at least taking care of the people who put their lives on the line for us, then we all ought to be ashamed. And that's true about police officers and firefighters, too. For us to say to police officers, you have to take a cut in pay so that we won't cut these jobs. And then they take a cut in pay, and then we fire them anyway. What are we doing? These are people we're asking to protect our lives, our homes, our families. We ought to take care of them. And we ought to take care of everybody when it comes to health care. There should not be a single person in this country who cannot get access to basic health care. We're the only, quote, civilized country on earth that doesn't provide universal access to basic health care. Again, I know it's difficult. I know it's controversial. The Health Reform Act was far from perfect. I have lots to criticize Obamacare for. But at least today, you can't be denied health insurance because you have a pre-existing condition. And at least children, dependent children, can stay on their parents' insurance policy up to age 26. And I'm sorry, but there is no way that we should ever go back to a time when insurance companies don't have to spend most of their money paying for health insurance. All of these things are the result of this Healthcare Reform Act. There are a lot of things we can criticize for, but when my opponent says, repeal it, and he has no better solution, and when he lied about it during the run-up to the vote, I'm sorry, I don't think that anybody ought to vote for Kevin McCarthy. I think that when a man lies to his constituents, he does not deserve to serve in Congress. I think the very least he owes us is the truth. I've challenged him to debate. He has said he would. I hope he'll keep his word.